So the Industrial Revolution. And first we'll start off with how it was before the Industrial Revolution. There's dear old mom. Okay, she's not my mom. But before the Industrial Revolution, people used to make their own clothes. And they did that through the use of a spinning wheel. And you would take the cotton, and as the cotton was wound around the wheel, the cotton would twist and turn and twist and turn and eventually come out as a nice little thread or yarn. And then that yarn would wrap around a little spool, a little round canister. And then once you got finished with that spool, you would then take that spool off and put an empty one on, and you'd repeat the process, and eventually you had like 2 spools of thread, and at that point you could start weaving them together to make a small piece of fabric. And then you'd have to go back to the spinning wheel and spin some more, and eventually come back and start weaving the thread together, make it a little bit larger piece of fabric. So a very large amount of time, and spending a large portion of your day at the spinning wheel, you could eventually make things like shirts and pants and things that you would wear. It was a long, complicated process until the Industrial Revolution. And I like to think of the Industrial Revolution as starting off with a love story. A love story between James and Elizabeth. So they lived in England in the mid-1700s. James had married his wonderful wife, Elizabeth, his nickname for her was Jenny, because she was a very vivacious, a very energetic type of person. And so at the time in the local area, Jenny was another way of saying machine. And so she always seemed to be full of energy and life. And so James married her, and unfortunately could not support her very well. James did not have a very good education at all. He basically did odd jobs in and around the area. And so he worked very long hours for very little money. And then when he came home, well, home to the house, or it was more like a hovel. It wasn't really, more like a hut than a house. But at any rate, there was his wife, and she was oftentimes still spinning away to make James's clothes and her clothes. And of course, James's and these clothes wore out pretty quickly. So James would come in, and oftentimes his wife had, fallen asleep at the spinning wheel, spinning all this yarn and thread for his clothes. And James felt really terrible. I mean, he loved his wife, and he really wanted the best for her. But again, he didn't have much of an education, so getting a good high-paying job wasn't really an option for him. But at any rate, one evening, he came home, and sure enough, Jenny was asleep, falling asleep at the spinning wheel again. And so James then decided to take her to the bed, and so he picked her up. But as he picked her up picked her up from the spinning wheel fell over, and so he didn't notice it too much. But he then took his wife and put her to bed and came back, and the wheel itself was still sort of spinning on the floor, and that sort of gave him an idea. And so for their next several days, well, actually several weeks, when he came home, he would say, if his wife was awake, it's like, hi, Jenny, but sorry, I have a little bit more work to do out in the back. And then in this little sort of shed in the back, Jenny could hear hammering and things like that. But eventually, after several weeks, James came home, and there's good old Jenny at the spinning wheel again, and said, Jenny, stop what you're doing. I have something to show you. And so James took Jenny out and to the shed, and there she saw an interesting machine. And uh, it looked like it had like several spools of thread and coming off it. And she says, And James says, here, watch this. And as he starts to turn the wheel, all of a sudden the cotton is basically is pulled into the machine, and it starts pulling and stretching the cotton into threads, but it basically separates the threads into 8 groups, and as the machine turns, there's 8 of these empty spools, and all the spools are basically getting thread at the same time. So this machine is actually making 8 spools of thread at the same time. And of course, Jenny instantly realizes what this means. This means that she could do 8 times the amount of work, or she could do the same amount of work in 1/8 of the time. And it's like you would only have to come to school and stuff for 8 hours a day. You'd only have to go 1 hour a day, and you still get the same amount of education. I'm sure you would be thrilled. Jenny was thrilled. And Elizabeth, Jenny. And so, of course, she, and James said, dear, I named it after you. I call it the Spinning Jenny. And of course, she threw her arms around him. And from then on, life was a little bit different because now Jenny had lots of free time. Of course, with she made the thread for James, but now she can make extra thread and sell it, and still have a lot of free time left over. And as such, she was able to supplement the family income, which means James had to work less, which means they both had free time. And so they lived a long, happy life, they and their 13 kids, because that's what happens when you have a lot of free time and you're married. Having said that, it doesn't require a genius to understand what's going to happen as a result of this invention, the spinning jenny, that can make a lot more thread by machine than just the spinning wheel can. So it doesn't take much of an imagination to realize that, though perhaps Jenny, of course, having so much free time, she can go visit the neighbors, and the neighbors think, wow, Jenny, don't you have work to do at home? And of course, Jenny says, well, my husband, he loves me so much that he invented this special machine just for me. He even named it after me, and it does basically 8 times the amount of work in the same amount of time. I can make 8 spools of thread when I used to just make 1 spool of thread, and it's amazing. And of course, all our friends are going, wow, that's amazing. And again, then you don't have to realize what's going to happen when that friend's husband comes home. Oh, hi, honey, I'm home. How are you doing? Oh, well, dear, just spinning away on the spinning wheel like I always am. Well, yeah, dear, but I can't do anything about that. Everybody in England has to do the same thing. Well, not everybody in England, dear. You see, down the street, Jenny has a husband who actually loves her, and he went and invented her machine. And the machine does like 8 times the amount of work, so Jenny has all this free time now. Of course, I don't have such a loving husband. Instead, I'm a no good, loser, lazy. Oh, excuse me, dear. I have to go out I'll be right back, dear. And of course, the gentleman now runs down to Hargrave's house and James, you have to show me how to build a machine. My wife's going to kill me. I have to have one of these machines. So pretty soon, there's not just one spinning jenny. There's 2 and 4 and 5, and then hundreds of thousands of them. And pretty soon, of course, a lot of English women are a lot happier because their workload is cut by a factor of 8. But again, you don't have to again have a great imagination to understand what comes next. Because if you can build a machine like the spinning jenny who has 8 empty spools, and when you turn the wheel, you have 8 spools of thread being produced at once. Why not 10? Why not 12? Why not 100? And soon you have these very large machines and producing almost 100 spools of thread at once. The only problem is, once you have so many spools, the tension, the friction of all these spools turning at once and all the thread moving around, pretty soon not only do you have a big wheel that you have to turn, but pretty soon it becomes a Herculean effort to turn the wheel because there's so much friction based on all the amount of work it has to do. So pretty soon, not even the strongest man alive, not even Mr. Beck, could be able to turn that wheel. So obviously, if you want to have more spools, you're going to have some way of making that big wheel turn. And that's where you have another Englishman coming in, a guy named Arkwright. And Mr. Arkwright has, he's basically grinding wheat and corn in England. And he does that through the use of a grinding mill, which is basically just a big stone circle crushing the wheat. And that big stone circle, that big stone is basically turned by a big metal rod, and that rod is then attached to a water wheel on the outside. And so as the river, the stream comes down and turns the big water wheel outside, that turns the rods inside, which crushes and turns this big rock, so to speak, which crushes the corn or wheat. But Mr. Arkwright quickly realizes that if you use the water power to turn this big rock to crush the wheat, you could use the water power to then turn that big wheel so you can make even more spools of thread, not just 100, but 200, 300, 400, 500, all at once. And something called the water frame is invented. So these are going to be very important to the economy when you have this large amount of textile work going on. And pretty soon, women, it gets so cheap that that you can go out and buy the thread. I mean, the women don't actually sit at the spinning wheel doing it anymore in England. Now, because you have these large water looms that make hundreds of spools at once by water power, the thread becomes so cheap you can make it yourself. And of course, you can buy it yourself and not have to worry about the spinning wheel and doing it because it's so cheap. But again, you don't really have to use your imagination much on this Industrial Revolution to understand what's going to come next. Because if the machines can make hundreds of spools of thread, if a machine can do the same type of work over and over and over and over again, then why can't you take these spools of thread and put them on some type of machine so the machine weaves the thread together? So instead of having, picking up 2 spools of thread at the store and then going home and weaving themselves together and sewing these spools of thread together yourself, why can't you invent a machine that basically takes these spools and weaves them together, and so you just have one large piece of cloth coming off the machine? And that, of course, is the next stage of the English Industrial Revolution. And so pretty soon, English women are a lot freer as far as time is concerned. Now they can go down and buy a large piece of cloth. Sure, at this point, you still have to cut the cloth out, and you still have to sort of weave it together. But still, that just having that cloth and not having to make it is a tremendous savings of time. And they produce so much cloth that England has so much cloth left over, they can sell it overseas. They can sell it in Europe and America and other places like that. And they're going to be making a lot of money off of it. So, again, in America now, after the Industrial Revolution in England, you can have, like, say, Ma and Pa, maybe in Massachusetts, and they're getting on the wagon. Oh, come on, Ma, have to go into town. Oh, I know, dear. I'm sorry. I was just working the spinning wheel. Okay, Ma. Okay, hold on. Let's go. And this couple rides into town, this American town. Pa says, well, I have to go to the hardware store, pick up some things for the farm. And Ma goes, well, that's okay. I'll just go in Sam's general store here and see what he has today. And of course, Ma goes in the store and she starts looking around. And then all of a sudden she sees a big piece of cloth, this huge piece of cloth. And she looks at Sam and says, why, Doggy Sam? Look at that huge piece of cloth. That must have taken someone 10 million years just to make. Oh, what, Sam? Machine, you say? A machine? You don't say, Sam. No. What? I can buy the cloth? You don't say, Sam. It's how cheap? Oh, Sam. Oh, I don't worry. I'm gonna buy that cloth. All right. Pa, get in here. Bring your money. And pretty soon, Ma and Pa are going home with this big roll of cloth. And now Ma's life back in America. Now she has a lot of free time. Of course, all that money Ma and Pa are spending on that English-made cloth is going to England, which means England is getting rich off America and getting rich off other places in Europe. And for the first time in its history, England is actually getting rich. And once you get rich, apparently you don't want to get poor. So England wants to make sure that its secrets, its ways of producing this cloth don't get out of England. It wants to make sure that nobody else in the world can produce the cloth like England can. And to do that, laws are passed in England. So you can't actually take a machine from England and send it to America or send it to anywhere else, because those machines are restricted only to England. And if you make plans for these machines, if you know how to, for example, operate these machines or know how to build these machines, you all of a sudden can't leave England either. And the plans can't leave England, because if these plans get out, other people are going to build machines, then England will be back to being poor again. And to enforce that, and of course, England's a bit luckier than some of the other places in the world as far as being able to stop people from leaving, because at the time, there was only one way off England. England was an island. So it's pretty hard to leave England except by ship. So at all the ports of England, you have these customs inspectors, and of course you're thinking, oh, I'll just hide the plans somewhere. No, the customs inspectors, they search very carefully. First of all, they make sure that your name's not on the list. Because again, if you know how to operate these machines, if you know how to repair these machines, if you know how to make the machines, your name's on the list. You're not going to be leaving England. I know what you're thinking already. I'll just give them a fake name. Well, maybe, but still, they're going to be searching you. Well, I'll just hide it someplace so they won't think. Well, they search pretty well. I mean, they do even full body cavity searches at the time to make sure you're not smuggling these plans out. But one Englishman, Samuel Slater, recognizes that if he can, get these plans out of England, like placed to America, he's going to be a millionaire basically overnight. People are going to pay him almost any amount of money if he can get these plans out of England. So one day, of course, Samuel Slater goes down to the docks and gives a fake name, but they search him very carefully. But he's hidden these plans one place where they can never find them. In his mind, he's memorized them. He arrives in America in the late 1790, and he basically just takes an ad out in the newspaper saying, "Here I am, I have the plans," and rich people in America knock themselves down trying to get to him. So the Industrial Revolution starts in Britain, in the textile or clothing industry, and then moves to America. By 1793, the first textile mill, using machines to make the thread and make the cloth, opens in New England. And one of the reasons Slater and others chose New England was because it had fast-flowing rivers. And the faster your river flows, that means the faster your water wheel goes, which means the more power it has, which means the more force it has, which means the more spindles you can actually make more cotton, or from the cotton you can make more thread and more cloth by having a faster flowing river. So in 1793, the first factory textile mill opens in New England. And of course, Samuel Slater becomes rich. So New England has a lot of good things going for it as far as the first textile mills. First of all, there's going to be a good workforce because there's not a lot of farming going on. The soil is poor for farming, doesn't have good nutrients to grow things, and you have a short growing season because of the long winters, which means not a lot of people are farmers, which means you have a lot of people who are left over to do work. Of course, you also have these fast-flowing rivers and streams for water power, but also New England sort of close to some resources, and they have many ports, which means, for example, of course, you have to bring the cotton in, so you can bring that in quickly by ship to your water mill, and then once you make the cloth, you need to quickly send it someplace else, to sell it, which in New England, of course, they had some very large cities, like Boston and other places you could sell it, but they also had a lot of ports where you can put the cloth on ships and quickly sell it to New York and Philadelphia and all the way down the coast and around the world. So New England had several things going for it as far as that's the reasons why they started the textile mills there in New England. Now, the American Industrial Revolution was sort of jump-started by the War of 1812. The first factory or textile mill starts in New England in 1793, and basically 14 years later, there were still only about 14 of these factories or mills operating in New England. They were pretty costly to build, and there were, of course, other ways to make money in New England. One of the major ways you made money was by shipping, was by trading things around the world. However, when the War of 1812 comes up, the British use their large navy to blockade the American coast, which means none of our ships can basically leave or go very far out to sea before they're seized. So all of a sudden, New Englanders who have all this money sort of tied up in shipping and trading, and they have all this money and they usually buy more ships, now have money, but they can't really put it in shipping because the ships don't go anywhere, which means they have to look for somewhere else to basically put their money to make more money. And now they have someplace to put their money, into these textile mills. So for example, so that's why basically you have this big jump basically from 1807 to 1815. So again, for a period of about 14 years, from 1793 to 1807, you have basically about 13 more mills being built. But then in basically the same time period, about seven years, you have like 120 more being built. And the reason is the War of 1812, Americans are investing in these mills. They're basically investing in America. And of course, that's going to do a lot of good things for America. And that's supposed to actually be by 1860, not 1869, but by 1860, by the start of the Civil War, Americans had 140,000 factories. So the Industrial Revolution really is jump-started by the War of 1812. But also, it's also jump-started by something else, something called interchangeable parts by Eli Whitney. So Eli Whitney is most famous, as we'll see later on in our course, for inventing the cotton gin or cotton engine, which cleans cotton. But before that, he was basically looking for a way to make money. And and one of his ideas was he was given a sort of tour of one of these textile mills in New England, and he was very impressed. You know, the machines basically worked the same way, and he was very impressed that every roll of thread was exactly the same size, exactly the same weight, exactly the same color, and he was amazed at these rolls of cloth that had exactly the same amount of cloth on every roll, and the dimensions were exactly the same. And from that, he sort of had a brainstorming revelation that basically said, well, if machines can make thread the same way, and machines can make cloth exactly the same way, why can't they make parts exactly the same way? And specifically, gun parts. So Eli Whitney recognized that as tensions with England sort of built up, leading to the War of 1812, the U.S. military was probably going to need lots of guns. But like most things at the time, guns were handmade. Most items were handmade at the time. And that's where you get the word smith. A smith was the one that made something. So a gunsmith made guns. And so the gunsmith would basically go down and chop down the tree and carve the wooden stock, the gunsmith would then like smelt the metal and make the nice round barrel, and he'd make the metal parts that held the barrel onto the wooden stock, and he'd make all these parts. So obviously it took him a long time, and so a gunsmith might produce a gun a week or something like that, and they sold at a pretty high price because, again, the gunsmith had to make them by hand. And if your gun broke, you had to take it back to the same gunsmith to get it fixed, because again, since every part was handmade, every part was a little bit different. Sometimes the barrel was a little bit smaller than the other guns. Sometimes it was a little bit bigger than the other guns. Sometimes your bands had a little bit bigger band length, and sometimes they had smaller band length, and the screws were also sort of made by hand. So if your rifle broke, that you had to take a gunsmith. And by the way, if you were just a part-time hunter, there's nothing wrong with that. If you were going to hunt and all of a sudden your rifle broke or your gun broke, you can take it to the gunsmith and don't worry, I'll have it back in a week, and that's fine if you're going part-time hunting or something. But if you're in the military and all of a sudden your musket breaks and you quickly rush, hey, I need this fixed, and the gunsmith, yeah, I'll come back in a week. A week? No, the enemy's marching. They'll be here in an hour or two. You have to fix this. Oh, I can't fix it in more. It'll take a couple of days to fix it. No, I have to have it in an hour. Well, too bad. So obviously, as Eli Whitney thought, he thought, wow, this would be a great way to make a lot of guns really fast. Plus, if any of the guns broke, because the machines made the part, you wouldn't have to go to the gunsmith. You'd simply have to order a part. You could keep spare parts with you in case those parts broke, or in case even if you weren't keeping those parts with you, a quick trip to the store and you could buy those parts. And so Eli Whitney designed a weapon, a musket at the time that basically had a limited amount of parts, and then he took these parts to Washington, D.C. and invited some generals to come watch, and then he basically took all these parts and put them in different sections. One little table was for the stocks, and one was for the gun barrels, and one was for the trigger mechanism, and one was for the trigger guard, and one was for the bands that held the barrel to the stock. And then he says, watch this. And he basically goes from one table to another, screwing parts in, and basically he makes one musket, then goes back, makes another musket, then comes back, make another musket, 10 muskets in 10 minutes. And the generals are thinking, wow, this is a miracle. And Eli Whitney says, no, it's not a miracle. It's interchangeable parts. So Eli Whitney gets a big gun contract and makes 10,000 guns. And so, of course, and obviously, the concept is even more important than the guns he makes. Because if you can make machine-made parts that make a gun and repair guns, why not clocks? Why not, well, anything that you have? So today, of course, for example, if your battery in your car doesn't work, you don't go out and buy a whole new car. You just go out and buy the battery. You buy an interchangeable part. So thanks to the War of 1812 and interchangeable parts, the American Industrial Revolution sort of jump-started. That is, because all this money is being poured into American-made factories, Americans are getting more and more and more of these factories for more and more items. So again, by 1860, you have 140,000 factories producing a large range of items, not just cloth, not just guns, but a lot of other stuff Americans use. So the Industrial Revolution changed and will change the way Americans work and lived. So before the Industrial Revolution, Americans basically worked at home. They were basically craftsmen, making things at home and setting their own schedule. Whether you were making cloth or whether you were making guns, You basically worked at home. You set your own schedule. So, if you're the master gunsmith or whatever, and you're making a gun a week, and you get enough money, you might want to go on vacation. So you just put a little sign on your door saying, "Gone for 2 weeks. Be back in 2 weeks." Or maybe if you're not feeling well in the morning, you sleep in a little bit later, and then you go back to your workshop, and then you start on your guns. Or maybe you start in the morning, you're working on your guns, but you decide to take the afternoon off. You could do that because you're the only one making that gun, and you set your own schedule. You work from home, and you sell basically enough just to make yourself as rich as you want. You sell enough guns to basically make to have a nice house and to have a nice little maybe a carriage, a nice horse or something like that, and have food on the table. And once you've made enough guns, you don't make any more. So that's before the Industrial Revolution. After the Industrial Revolution, people are going off to work and setting their own schedule. So if you're in one of these gun factories, the machines, sure, they make the stock and they make the barrel and they make the trigger guard, and the machines make the bands. But you have to have workers. You have to have workers at the wooden stock table to hand it over to the guy with the barrel, and the guy with the barrel is screwing the barrel onto the wooden form, and then you pass that off to the guy that puts the trigger mechanism on, and then you pass it off to the guy that puts the trigger guard on, then you pass that guy to put the bands around the gun, and eventually down at the end, after all these workers have screwed everything in, then you have a working musket. But let's say you're the guy that basically takes the gun and puts the trigger on the gun. But if you're not at work that day, what happens is the guy with the stock passes the guy with the barrel, and they put their stuff on, they put the bands around it, and they pass it off to the person that's supposed to be there to put the trigger on it, but you're not there. And so all of a sudden, the muskets aren't getting made. They're just sort of piling up. Half-made muskets are just sort of piling up, which means from now on, everybody has to be at their assigned place at the assigned time, which means if one person leaves, the whole assembly line basically stops, which means if you have to take lunch, everybody has to take it at the same time, and everyone has to be back at the same time. So now your work schedule is set by someone else, and you're not working at home because machine-made parts take a machine, and machines are extremely expensive, more expensive than one person can afford. So now you have to go someplace to work called a factory. And now someone sets a schedule about what time you have to be there, and what time lunch is, and what time you have to be back from lunch, and what time you leave. And of course, if you're going off to work, now of course people are thinking, well, if everyone has to be at work at a certain time, well, how can I maybe I can make something that will help them get to work on time. And so you're going to have a lot of offshoots, a lot of things that are being made simply because you have factories and simply because you have people that go to work and are setting their own schedule. And what about the master craftsman? Well, sorry, your life is coming to an end. The way of life you have is coming to an end. So you might be the master gunsmith, but if you're making 1 gun a day and the factory is making like 1,000 guns a day or 10,000 guns a day, the price for their musket is going to be really, really small compared to your musket. You might be charging $20 for your musket. They're charging like $1 for their musket, which means people are buying their muskets and not your muskets. And that also means you used to repair guns, but now people can repair their own guns because machines produce barrels and machines produce the screws the same way every time. That means that basically people just go to the store and buy the parts they need and put it on a gun themselves. And so you as the master craftsman, you're going to be out of business. So what do you do when you're out of business? You still need a job? You're probably going to go down the factory and get a job there. Of course, now, of course, again, your schedule is going to be set by someone else. Now, that's sort of the downside of the Industrial Revolution, along with several other downsides. One of the upsides is that now that you're for having all these things made by machine, they're being being made by the thousands and tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands, and that drives down the cost. So now these things are going to be, these items that you wanted, like a gun or like a clock or whatever, are going to be really cheap, a lot cheaper than they used to be, which means you, who, I only had one gun, and if it breaks, I'll take the mask out. No, you buy another gun just in case, maybe 3 or 4 guns. A clock, don't you buy one clock, you buy maybe a couple of clocks for the house. I mean, after all, if clocks are so cheap, why just have one clock in your one room? I mean, now you have to walk from room to room to go see the time. No, you buy a clock for every room. That way, you don't have to leave the room. And so thanks to the revolution, Industrial Revolution, more Americans were buying more merchandise at lower prices.